Summer started as it always did. Richard, his nephew Liam, and I were heading to the old family lake house. The house needed repairs, which gave Richard the perfect excuse to immerse himself in work, leaving me to myself. As usual, I nodded when he suggested spending a few weeks there. I naively hoped that here, away from the city, he might finally pay attention to us, but everything unfolded predictably. Liam sat in the back seat watching us with curiosity. Young, full of life, he was the polar opposite of his uncle. His laughter, at times utterly unrestrained, filled the car, breaking the silence between Richard and me. While Richard focused on the road, Liam shared stories from university, some embarrassingly candid. "Are you always this serious behind the wheel, Uncle?" he teased, stretching his legs and letting out an exaggerated yawn. Richard muttered something in response, his eyes never leaving the road. I glanced at the rearview mirror and caught Liam's gaze. His smile was faintly mischievous, almost daring. The house greeted us with neglect. Weeds wrapped around the steps, paint peeled off, and the garden looked like a jungle. To Richard, this wasn't a problem but a challenge. He immediately began planning without even stepping inside. "This place needs a complete overhaul," he muttered, surveying the exterior. I stood beside him nodding, but my thoughts were elsewhere. His voice carried an enthusiasm I hadn't heard when it came to me in years. Liam was in his element. He gestured energetically, listing ways he could help. Watching him, I couldn't help but smile. His youth, his ease, all of it felt both foreign and enticing. By evening, Richard was fully absorbed in his plans. Over dinner, he talked about timelines, tools, and materials. He barely noticed me. Liam tried to keep the conversation lively, but even his efforts faded. When a call came through, Richard didn't even apologize. He simply stood and stepped onto the porch. Through the open window, I could hear his confident voice discussing supplies. I was left alone with Liam. We sat in silence. The clink of cutlery against plates filled the air. I glanced at him. His usual lightheartedness was gone. He looked unusually focused. "Is he always like that?" he suddenly asked without looking up. The question caught me off guard. I pretended not to understand, but something stung inside me. "He's just a passionate man," I finally said, as if justifying not him, but myself. Liam smirked slightly as though reading my mind. When Richard returned, dinner was over. He sat without asking how our time had been. I barely listened to his words about plans. I was distracted by Liam's glances, which seemed to carry an unspoken meaning. Those glances unsettled me. As I climbed the stairs to bed, I felt Liam's eyes follow me. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. The next day, he was back to his usual self, cheerful, energetic, with an endless stream of jokes. But I knew then that something in our house would change this summer. The next morning, we tackled the garage. Decades of clutter, old boxes filled with books, tools, and junk had accumulated there. As usual, Richard was busy with more important outdoor tasks, and Liam offered to help me. "Let me handle these boxes. They're obviously too heavy for you," he said with a grin as I reached for the first one. "I can manage," I replied, but he had already taken the box from my hands. I watched as he effortlessly hoisted it onto his shoulder and carried it to a shelf. Youth. There was such natural strength and confidence in his movements that I felt momentarily foolish for trying to handle everything myself. We worked in silence until I attempted to grab a box from the top shelf. It was much heavier than I expected. The balance shifted instantly, and before I knew it, the box slipped from my hands and I fell, straight onto Liam. He landed beneath me, exhaling sharply. His hands instinctively found my waist, holding me firmly. For a moment, everything froze. I felt the warmth of his palms through the thin fabric of my shirt and heard his breath deepen. I tried to get up, but his grip remained steady. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his tone unexpectedly serious. "Yes, of course," I replied quickly, trying to pull myself up. His hands slid along my sides as he helped me stand. The touch was fleeting but sent an inexplicable shiver through me. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you, but boxes don't seem to be your thing," he added with a smile, though his gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual. I forced myself to turn away, brushing off the moment. It was just an accident. But after that, Liam found more reasons to stay close. He offered help with little tasks, struck up conversations, and occasionally threw in light remarks that could be taken as jokes. "You have good taste," he said once, examining an old vase. "You picked this, didn't you?" I didn't reply immediately, busy dusting off a shelf. But his voice, his casual demeanor, his ease, they started to get to me. I noticed I began to enjoy his attention. His compliments and light flirtation might have been a game, but I increasingly caught myself waiting for those moments. When we finished, I lingered in the garage, looking over what we had sorted. Liam stood nearby, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. He looked relaxed and pleased with himself. "Thanks for your help," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Always happy to help. If you ever need anything else, just let me know." I nodded, smiling. But inside, I felt a strange sensation, as though his help meant more than simple kindness between a nephew and his aunt. The house had settled into its nighttime quiet. Every time Richard left for town on business, I was left alone with Liam, and these evenings were filled with a strange tension I tried to ignore. Tonight was one of those nights. I sat in the living room with a book, unable to focus. The silence in the house was sporadically interrupted. Creaking floorboards, the faint rustling of wind outside. And then, I heard another sound. Soft at first, muffled but growing more distinct. The sounds were coming from the far end of the hallway, from Liam's room. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was probably just music or some harmless noise. But curiosity, as always, proved stronger. Moving carefully, I made my way toward the source. Light spilled through the narrow crack of Liam's slightly open door, slicing through the darkness of the hallway. Every step felt impossibly loud, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached the door and peeked through the gap. On the bed, Liam and a girl. She was lying on her back, propped up slightly on her elbows, while he leaned over her. Their movements were rhythmic, filled with an intimacy that left no room for doubt. Her hair was scattered across the pillows, his hands gliding along her sides, lingering, pulling her closer. Their faces were so close it seemed they might dissolve into one another. It was unmistakable. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I tried to make myself leave, but I couldn't. Something hypnotic held me there. The way her body moved in perfect response to his. For a fleeting moment, I imagined myself in her place. The thought hit me like a jolt of electricity, but instead of revulsion, I felt warmth spreading through me. My breathing quickened, and I pressed my hands to my chest to stop myself, but it only intensified the sensation. His voice came softly, though I couldn't make out the words. She smiled, her fingers gently brushing his face. At that moment, she lifted her head, her eyes scanning the room as though sensing a presence. Panic surged through me. I backed away abruptly, careful not to make a sound. Moments later, I was in the dark of my room, the door shut tightly behind me. I collapsed onto the bed, my hands trembling. Fear, shame, and a strange sense of guilt overwhelmed me. But deeper still, there was something else. A sharp desire I hadn't felt in a very long time. The image of Liam and that girl, their movements, their connection. It stayed with me as I lay in the darkness. I woke early, but sleep hadn't brought relief. My head felt heavy, as though I'd spent the night running in endless circles trying to escape my thoughts. The image of Liam and that girl resurfaced the moment I closed my eyes. Their movements, their closeness. It wouldn't let go of me. I ran a hand over my face as if trying to erase the memory. Waves of shame washed over me. How could I do something like that, watching them? But beneath the shame lay another feeling, one I was afraid to acknowledge. Desire. In the kitchen, everything was routine. Morning light poured over the counters. Richard, engrossed in his phone, was discussing some work matter. Liam appeared a little later, wearing a casual t-shirt and shorts, his hair messily tousled. "Morning," he said with a grin. I nodded, hoping my expression wouldn't betray the turmoil inside me. His gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual, but then he poured himself some coffee and sat down, acting as though nothing had happened. I spent the entire morning looking for signs that he might have noticed me last night. Something in his behavior, the tone of his voice, his movements. But he was calm, serene as ever. It even left me feeling oddly disappointed. Richard left for town, leaving the two of us alone. I tried to occupy myself with household chores. I washed curtains, cleaned windows, but every time my eyes inadvertently landed on Liam, the memories came flooding back. I saw his fingers gliding over her skin, his smile directed at her, and, unable to help myself, imagined being in her place. These thoughts came in flashes, but each left a mark. I blushed, turned away, trying to focus on anything else to rid myself of this fixation. Around midday, I decided to work in the garden. Physical labor seemed like the best way to distract myself. But soon, I heard his voice behind me. "Need any help?" Liam stood nearby, holding a bottle of water. I turned away, pretending to be busy. "No, thanks, I've got it," I said. "Still love this garden," he continued, looking out at the trees. "Feels like it's from another time." I didn't respond. His presence brought back another wave of memories. Every movement, every step he took. A shiver ran down my spine as he stepped closer. I turned to leave, but caught the edge of the shovel and almost tripped. Liam grabbed my arm to steady me. His grip was firm, and as our eyes met, I felt the same electric charge I'd felt last night. "You okay?" His voice was steady, but I noticed the corner of his mouth twitch into a smile. "Yes, thanks," I exhaled, quickly pulling away. I went back inside, feeling the heat rise to my face. I felt like I was on the edge, that any moment now my hidden thoughts would spill out for everyone to see. For the rest of the day, I avoided Liam, but even his absence didn't help. My mind conjured scenes I was too afraid to admit to myself. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined his hands on me. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. That evening, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Inside me, a storm raged: fear, shame, desire. I knew it was wrong, but every part of me screamed that I could no longer pretend I felt nothing. All day I tried to avoid Liam, but his presence seemed to fill the entire house. Even when he wasn't nearby, I felt him everywhere. Every little thing, the sound of footsteps, his soft laughter, his shadow in the hallway, reminded me of everything that had unfolded within me over the past few days. When night fell, I decided it was best to go to bed early. Richard was still in the living room, buried in his laptop and work files. He barely noticed as I passed by. I stepped into the bedroom, closed the door behind me, and took a deep breath. I just wanted to escape my thoughts and sink into oblivion. But as I approached the bed, my eyes fell on a small piece of paper lying on the pillow. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, as though trying to warn me. The paper was folded neatly in half. Slowly, I picked it up, feeling my fingers tremble slightly. Unfolding the note, I recognized the handwriting. Bold, slightly slanted letters written with confident strokes. "You thought I didn't see you watching me and my girlfriend? Come downstairs tonight when Uncle Richard is asleep." The note slipped from my hands and landed on the bed. My heart skipped a beat. A loud ringing filled my ears. He knows. He saw everything. Shame flooded over me. I pressed my hands to my burning face. I couldn't believe he had written this on purpose. How could he, and why? But along with the shame came another feeling. Desire, bubbling up despite my efforts to suppress it. His words, though written as a challenge, carried a confidence that sent shivers through me. I stood and began pacing the room, clenching my hands. "No," I told myself firmly. "It's just a provocation. A silly joke from a young man that means nothing. You can't respond to this." But every attempt to convince myself I would stay in my room was met with a surge of yearning. I imagined him waiting, his gaze, his smile, the way he spoke as if he always knew more than he let on. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the note in my hands. I stared at it for a long time, as if hoping the words would disappear if I looked long enough. In the next room, Richard calmly continued his work. The whole house was in a peaceful nighttime lull, but inside me a storm raged. When the clock struck midnight, I realized I was still sitting there. My clothes were slightly rumpled, my hands nervously fidgeting with the edge of the note. "I won't go," I said aloud. But my voice sounded uncertain, as if the words were nothing more than a feeble attempt to maintain control. And yet, the more I tried to convince myself, the stronger the pull became. It was irresistible, like gravity. I knew this choice would change everything. But burning with shame and desire, I slowly began to step toward the door. The house had fallen silent. The light in Richard's study had long gone out, and his steady breathing carried through the thin walls. I sat at the edge of the bed, my hand gripping the doorknob. Every movement felt impossible. I tried to convince myself to stay, told myself the note was just a joke, a provocation I could ignore. But the longer I sat, the stronger the pull became. It left me no choice. I opened the door quietly and tiptoed down the hallway. My heart pounded loudly in my chest, so loud I feared it might echo through the house. The guest bedroom was at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and a soft glow from a bedside lamp spilled out. I stepped inside, holding my breath. Liam was leaning against the windowsill, gazing out into the night. He turned when he heard my steps, a knowing smile spreading across his face, as if he had always been certain I would come. "I didn't think you'd dare," he said softly, but his voice carried a confidence that took my breath away. "This is ridiculous," I began, hoping my tone sounded firm. "You're playing games and I—" "And you came," he interrupted, taking a step toward me. I retreated, my back pressing against the closed door. The room felt stifling. He moved slowly, his gaze both bold and searching. "Did you like it?" he asked, stopping just inches away. "Like what?" I tried to feign ignorance, but my voice faltered. "What you saw." His words hung in the air like a challenge. I dropped my gaze, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean—" I began, but he leaned closer, cutting me off. "You're saying you didn't like it?" His voice was softer now, almost a whisper, but every word dug deep, making it hard to breathe. I tried to brush it off with a joke. "You think too highly of yourself?" Instead of responding, he reached out and touched my face. The gesture was gentle, but there was a firmness to it. His fingers slid to my neck, and I felt a wave of warmth rush through me. I wanted to push him away, to say this was a mistake, but my hands seemed to act on their own, resting against his chest. And then he kissed me. It was sudden, bold, as if he had no intention of asking for permission. For a moment I tried to resist, but his lips, his touch, broke down every last defense. The world around us disappeared. It was just the two of us. His breath, the warmth of his body, his hands wrapping around me, pulling me closer. When the kiss broke, I stood frozen, unable to move. Liam looked at me, and there was no regret in his eyes. He knew he had crossed a line, and he didn't care. "So, are you sure I was wrong?" he asked with a slight smile. I didn't know what to say. Inside me, a storm raged. Fear, shame, and that undeniable burning feeling I could no longer deny. I turned away, opened the door, and left, feeling his gaze follow me. But when I returned to my bedroom, my lips still remembered his touch. I returned to my bedroom, moving as quietly as possible so as not to wake Richard. Behind the closed door, I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. My body was trembling, but it wasn't just from exhaustion. I ran my fingers over my lips, which still burned from his kiss. Every moment in that room, his touch, his voice, it all replayed in my mind like a broken record. I felt guilty. This was wrong. I knew that. But instead of relief for walking away, I was overwhelmed by a deep ache. I collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in the pillow. My mind screamed, "Forget it! You can't let this continue!" But my body rebelled, clinging to the memory of his arms around me, his lips demanding a response. These thoughts kept me awake all night, with only brief moments of restless sleep. The next morning I got up early. Sunlight flooded the room, but I felt as though heavy shadows hung over my heart. I went downstairs, hoping Richard had already left for the hardware store so I could have some time to collect myself. But Liam was there. He was sitting at the table, sipping coffee, looking completely at ease, as if the night before had changed nothing. He glanced up and nodded when I entered. "Morning," he said casually. "Morning," I replied, avoiding his gaze. I felt the heat rising to my cheeks. He acted so nonchalantly, as though last night had been nothing but a dream. But I knew it had been real, and it drove me mad. I pretended to be busy, pouring myself tea and wiping down the counters. Liam stayed where he was, silently watching me. His quiet presence was infuriating and made me anxious. When he finally stood and moved closer, I tensed. "Relax, Aunt Ellie," he said with a slight smirk, leaning against the sink beside me. "You're acting like we did something terrible." I turned to him abruptly. "We did!" I exclaimed, my voice trembling in a way I barely recognized. Liam chuckled as though my protest amused him. "It's what you wanted," he said calmly. I shook my head, turned away, and walked out to the garden, hoping I could finally be alone. But Liam seemed to have other plans. Every time I tried to retreat somewhere, he found a way to be near me. It seemed accidental, but I knew it wasn't. While I was tending to the flowers, he approached, holding a pair of gardening shears. "Need help?" he asked, his tone still as casual and confident as ever. "No," I snapped, not even looking at him. "You know running away is pointless," he said quietly, but loud enough for me to hear. I didn't reply. Inside, a storm raged. I wanted to hate him for breaking my world apart, but I hated myself even more for wanting him to stay. The garage had become my sanctuary again, a space where I could pretend to be busy, rearranging tools, dusting shelves, hoping to find some semblance of order in the chaos of my mind. But my thoughts refused to obey. They circled back to Liam, his words, his touch, the look in his eyes I couldn't erase. The door creaked and I turned. Liam entered, carrying a box. He didn't say a word, setting it down as if his presence here needed no explanation. I pretended to focus on my tasks, though every part of me was on edge. He moved closer, stopping by the workbench and leaning against it. I could feel his gaze, heavy and unrelenting, like it was burning into my back. The silence between us felt tangible. At some point, I couldn't bear it anymore. Gathering all my strength, I turned around. His face was calm, but there was a faint trace of mockery in his eyes, one he didn't bother to hide. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air between us. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, but the words caught in my throat. His expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious, almost challenging. It was as if he already knew all the answers to the questions I didn't dare ask. I looked away, trying to focus on my work, but my hands were trembling. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. By evening, Richard insisted on having a family dinner. His voice, when he called us, was unnaturally even, as if he were trying to mask something. I could feel his growing suspicion. At the table, I barely touched my food. Richard talked about his plans for the house, trying to spark conversation. But my attention wandered. All I could feel was Liam's presence across from me. When Richard briefly stepped away to take a call, I glanced up and met Liam's eyes. He was looking at me in a way that made my breath catch. The moment was brief, but it shattered whatever composure I had left. My fork slipped from my hand, clattering loudly against the plate. Richard turned back, frowning, and asked if I was all right. I nodded, forcing a smile, though it felt hollow and weak. The rest of the dinner passed in silence. When I finally escaped upstairs, I felt as though I was drowning in the tension I could no longer ignore. The morning carried a heavy stillness, even though the sun shone brightly outside. The house felt suffocatingly quiet, muting even my own thoughts. Richard had left for town to pick up supplies, leaving Liam and me alone. I spent the time in the living room, pretending to read, but the words blurred on the page. When Liam entered, I felt his presence before I saw him. He stopped beside me, resting his hand on the back of my chair. "Let's go for a walk," he said. I looked up at him. He was so calm, as if he were inviting me to simply enjoy the fresh air, not to stoke the flames that already burned between us. I wanted to refuse, but I couldn't. Every part of me was drawn to him like a magnet. We followed a trail that led deep into the woods. Birds chirped, leaves crunched underfoot, but the idyllic surroundings couldn't quiet the pounding of my heart. Liam walked beside me, his steps confident, the silence between us filled with an unbearable tension. When we reached a fallen tree, he stopped and turned to me. His expression was serious, and there was something in his gaze that made my throat dry. "You know this is wrong," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. I nodded but couldn't find the words to respond. "Then why did you come?" His voice was quiet, but every word cut through me like a blade. "I don't know," I exhaled, caught between shame and the pull that brought me to him. He stepped closer and I felt my entire body tense. His hand brushed against mine. "You're not resisting," he said, his voice just above a whisper. I couldn't reply. His face was so close I could feel the warmth of his breath. And then he kissed me again, Dot. This time I didn't fight it. My body responded instinctively as if it had been waiting for this moment for far too long. Everything around us, the trees, the birdsong, the rustling wind, faded away. There was only his lips, his hands pulling me closer, holding me so tightly I felt myself losing control. When the kiss broke, I could barely breathe. Liam looked at me, his eyes calm but burning with a confidence that made my head spin. We walked back in silence. The house was as quiet as it had been before, but inside, everything screamed. The tension between us had grown too obvious to ignore. When we returned, I shut myself in my room, feeling a mix of fear and the undeniable truth of what I could no longer resist. The morning began like any other, but the air in the house felt thick with tension. I sensed it in everything, the silence that filled the rooms, the creak of floorboards as Richard rose from his chair and walked to his study. Ever since I had crossed the line, it felt as though every step I took betrayed the secret I was desperately trying to keep. In the kitchen, I found the note, its uneven edges, the familiar handwriting. It was the same one Liam had left for me days ago. A sudden jolt of panic shot through me. How had it ended up here? Richard entered just as I stood frozen, the note in my hand. His calm expression only heightened my anxiety, as if he already knew something. He took it from me, glancing briefly at the words. "Whose note is this?" he asked, slowly placing it on the table. I couldn't breathe but tried to maintain a facade of calm. "Probably Liam's, maybe for his girlfriend," I replied, willing my voice not to shake. Richard said nothing. His eyes lingered on my face for a moment before he silently left the room. When he drove off on his errands, a wave of weakness washed over me. Everything I had been trying to hide seemed closer to being exposed than ever before. Later, Liam appeared in the garage. His composure was infuriating. He watched me as if everything was unfolding according to his plan. I tried to busy myself, but tools slipped from my grasp. My hands shook and my thoughts were a mess. I wanted to push him away, but his silence, his confidence left me powerless. By evening, Richard announced he'd be leaving for a couple of days. His voice was casual, but to me it was like a taut string snapping. This unexpected opportunity was something I had both anticipated and feared. After he left, I carefully planned everything. Liam's girlfriend had to be sent away, so I handed her a long shopping list and asked her to go to town. I feigned exhaustion, saying I couldn't manage it myself. She agreed without question. To Liam, I explained that we urgently needed to organize the shelves in the garage. The excuse was plausible enough to avoid suspicion if anyone asked. But inside, a storm raged. While I meticulously worked through my plan, every thought was accompanied by the anxious realization that this had gone too far. When I was finally alone in the quiet of the house, I realized I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. The next step would change everything. The day was quiet. The whole house seemed steeped in a lazy summer haze. I watched as Liam's girlfriend left with the long shopping list I had given her, her cheerful smile hiding any suspicion. I wished her luck, forcing an air of sincerity, though inside, I was wound tight with anticipation. I lingered in the living room, pretending to busy myself with trivial tasks. But every step, every sound pulled my attention toward the garage, where Liam was waiting. One thought played over and over in my mind. This is my moment. When I entered the garage, he was there, idly sorting through tools. His gaze lifted as I walked in, a faintly mischievous smile spreading across his face. "She's gone?" he asked, as though it were the most mundane thing in the world. I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped closer, feeling the tension coil tightly within me. My voice was quiet but firm. "We can't keep waiting." Liam froze. His smile faded, replaced by something deeper. Surprise mixed with intrigue. I moved closer still, the space between us reduced to a fragile thread. At that moment, I cast aside my doubts. My hand reached out, resting against his chest before sliding up to his neck. His gaze grew serious, but I could see the desire flickering there. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Instead of answering, I pulled him toward me and kissed him. It was decisive, almost abrupt, but everything inside me was ablaze. I couldn't fight myself anymore. He wrapped his arms around me, his warmth almost searing, though I felt him hesitate for a brief moment, surprised by my boldness. Then his movements became confident, insistent. It was a flash, a storm, a moment that pulled me out of reality. When it ended, we were both breathless, but a faint smile tugged at his lips. "I didn't expect this from you," he said, running a hand through his hair. I turned away, feeling the familiar wave of shame crash over me. But instead of letting it settle, Liam shattered the moment with his next suggestion. "Caitlin's mentioned she's curious about trying something different. She's fantasized about an older, more experienced woman." At first, I didn't understand what he was implying, but his gaze, steady and challenging, made it clear this wasn't a casual remark. "Are you serious?" My voice came out louder than I intended. "It could be our secret," he said calmly, as if he were suggesting a new recipe to try. Shock overtook me. I stepped back, my thoughts scrambling for clarity. "No, absolutely not," I said, trying to sound firm. I left the garage, a storm raging inside me, but the more I tried to dismiss the idea, the more his words echoed in my mind. The thought wouldn't leave, pulling at me with its danger, unraveling the order of my world. I avoided him, but it grew increasingly difficult. He provoked me, his glances, his subtle remarks, his presence that felt too close. After days of internal turmoil, I gave in. His confidence, his assurances that no one would ever know, dismantled the last of my resistance. When I finally agreed, it felt like a plunge into the abyss. But deep down, I knew this fall was inevitable. From the morning, I could feel the tension building. Liam and Caitlin went about their day as if there was nothing unusual about it. Their calm demeanor only heightened the storm brewing inside me. During lunch, Richard mentioned he needed to head to town to resolve some work matters. His words felt like a signal. Liam, seated across from me, gave me a brief look filled with quiet confidence. Once Richard left, Caitlin and Liam began their preparations. She placed candles on the table, arranged small decorations as if this were an ordinary dinner. But I knew it was merely a facade. "Relax, it's going to be perfect," Caitlin said when she noticed my tension. Her voice was light, almost melodic, and I nodded despite myself. Her behavior surprised me. There was no trace of the nervousness I felt coursing through me in her gestures or her words. That evening, we gathered in the living room. Caitlin poured me a glass of wine, her smile effortlessly natural. I could feel her calmness starting to affect me. Her compliments, soft, unassuming, slowly broke down the walls I had built around myself. "You don't realize how beautiful you are," she said, lightly brushing her fingers against my hand. I looked away, feeling a warmth rise inside me. Her closeness was both intimidating and alluring. Liam remained silent, but his presence was so tangible it made it hard to breathe. When the tension reached its peak, Caitlin made the first move. Her fingers glided gently over my arm, the touch carrying more weight than it should have. She leaned closer, her eyes seeking my permission. The world around me began to fade. I felt the air in the room grow thick, her movements so fluid and assured, pushing me toward the inevitable. Liam stepped closer. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder, his presence adding an even greater charge to the moment. My head spun, but in that instant, I wasn't thinking about what might come next. And then everything shattered. The door burst open with a loud crash as it slammed against the wall. My gaze tore away from Caitlin, and I saw Richard standing in the doorway. His eyes blazed with fury, his entire body trembling as if he was barely holding himself back from shouting. "What is going on here?" His voice boomed, louder than I had ever heard it before. The world froze. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I searched for words, any words. But my mouth was dry and my tongue felt paralyzed. Richard stepped forward, his gaze darting between the three of us. His face was not just angry, it was filled with pain and betrayal. "Allison," he bellowed, focusing all his attention on me. "Is this some kind of joke? Are you mocking me?" I couldn't answer. My legs felt rooted to the floor and a crushing weight pressed down on my chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. "Explain yourself," he demanded, his voice breaking into a yell. At that moment, Liam stood. His expression remained calm, but his voice carried a firm resolve. "This is my fault, Uncle," he said. "I started all of this. He hesitated, searching for the right words, but Richard cut him off sharply. "Shut up," he roared, his anger now directed at Liam. "Do you think I want your excuses? You destroyed my family, invaded my home, and turned it into a circus." Caitlin tried to speak, but Richard silenced her with a glare full of disgust. "And you too. Pack your things and get out, both of you." His voice trembled with rage, but he wasn't finished. His eyes turned back to me. "And you? I don't want to see you in this house again. Take Liam's car and leave." His words cut through me like a blade. I felt the ground fall away beneath me. He wasn't shouting, but his voice was filled with such fury and disappointment that it hurt more than any scream ever could. Unable to respond, I simply nodded, as if that was the only option left. Liam remained silent, his gaze heavy with guilt and something else I couldn't decipher. Caitlin was the first to leave the room, her face pale and her hands trembling. Liam hesitated for a moment, looking at me, but I couldn't meet his eyes. We left the house in complete silence. Liam's car stood in the driveway, cold like the air around us. I climbed into the back seat, feeling everything inside me collapse. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time, and only then did the tears begin to fall.